Miskien moet jy eers Jy het nou net af. Goeienaand, dames en heren. Oweni manene manenikaze. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am very honored to be able this evening to introduce Professor Johan Fourie, who will soon deliver his inaugural address as the 19th Professor of Economics since the first Professor of Economics was approved in 1920, so 102 years ago. I first met Johan as an honor student in public economics in my class in 2005. And I was privileged after that to interact with him in several ways since his appointment as junior lecturer in January 2006. He was particularly resourceful, or maybe even at times a little bit cunning, in drawing me and various other colleagues into various projects without you knowing you were in it. In 2012, he obtained his PhD in economic history from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. In this, he investigated the nature, causes, and distribution of wealth of 18th century Cape society. In 2012, I attended a conference of the World History Economic Association in Utrecht. Johan, who was studying in Utrecht at the time, also was there. At our accommodation, we had the use of bicycles. So one evening, Johan and I took to the road. As we approached the stop sign at a fairly brisk speed, Johan suddenly exclaimed anxiously, "Prof, die ding het nie remme nie." Prof, this thing has no brakes. Just in time, he discovered the back pedal brakes. But Johan's progress in academic life, albeit in economic history, is not one of backpedaling, but of admirable forward momentum. Johan epitomizes the versatility of a well-balanced scholar. Not only was he awarded the university's Vice-Chancellor Award for Research in 2012, 2013, 2015, and he would have received more, but other people had to get the chance as well. His many publications in a variety of South African and international academic journals, together with his successful supervision of master's and doctoral students, have earned him a prestigious B1 rating from the National Research Foundation. This reflects the considerable international recognition for the high quality and impact of his recent research outputs. What also testifies to his wider recognition as a scholar is his affiliation to the Department of History at Stellenbosch University and him being a research associate at the Centre for Economic History at the Australian National University and at the Cage Research Centre at the University of Warwick in England. He undoubtedly carved out a niche for himself in the economics department, thereby filling the gap left by the well-known Professor Saint-Pieter Blanche, not in the disciple mode of yesteryear, but in ways that are specific to his own views and approaches and methodologies. The nature of his published papers and his successful supervision of many economic history-specific PhD students are cases in point. Professor Fourie serves the South African economic history community and the African history community in various roles, such as having been a founding member of the African Economic History Network in 2011, a co-editor of Economic History for Developing Regions, as board member and former president of the Economic History Society of Southern Africa, as board member of the International Economic History Association since 2022, and as current or former editorial board member of prominent scientific journals, namely the Economic History of Developing Regions, the Journal of Economic History, and Cliometrica. To formalize his interactive research with his students and colleagues, he established the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past with the interesting acronym LEAP. Leap into the future, not leap into the past, I presume. This was established in the economic department. Recently, in 2021, Professor Fourie published an accessible introduction to global economic history, written from a South African perspective. The book, Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom, was a commercial success, not a common achievement by academics. The international rights have been purchased since by Cambridge University Press, with the international edition set to appear in July this year. An Afrikaans version, Ryker, Wealthier, will appear in 2022, towards the end of this year. What is quite impressive is Professor Fourie's ability to mobilize research funds from various sponsors on account of his scholarly capabilities and reputation and his academic entrepreneurship. The most recent being a huge grant of 48 million rand from the Swedish Central Bank's Jubileum Fund. Professor Fourie is leading with these funds, leading the Cape of Good Hope Panel 2 project, which will cover 5 years from 2021 to 2026, and he does this together with the Swede Eric Green as co-principal investigator. And partners to this project include such eminent American institutions as the Smithsonian Institute and the Mellon Foundation. This path-breaking project flies under the banner of Biography of an Uncharted People and is named Digital Humanities and the Data Revolution, wish it was Resolution, Data Revolution in South African history. It is a mega data project whereby historical information is made easily accessible. It will thus give dignity to Black, Colored, and Indian South Africans, enabling them to bring to light the histories of families that were overlooked in the past. The project will also begin to analyze the information systematically in order to contribute to debates in South African history. In addition to the research topics to be undertaken by masters and honors students, 5 flagship projects for PhD students have been identified. What is particularly praiseworthy is the project Envisage Feedback on undergraduate students. This fits the mold of Johan Fourie as an excellent, inspiring, and innovative teacher, which characterizes another dimension of his versatile academic profile. Not only does this project have a feedback on undergraduate and postgraduate courses in economic history, but it also received the departmental and director's award for him, retrospectively, for teaching in 2008. At least 8 of his postgraduate students have received or are in the process of completing their PhDs, a big number of them at foreign universities. Professor Fourie's balance as an academic also extends to his contributions to society. As a columnist and blogger, not to be confused with a cartoonist and a rapper, he frequently contributes to public policy institutions and the dissemination of research. Through his public profile, he encourages more evidence-based policymaking. His blog has more than 700 subscribed readers, and he is a monthly columnist for the Sunday newspaper Report and was a bi-weekly columnist for Finance Week until 2021. He also serves or has served as a member of various bodies, such as the Stellenbosch University Council, and as chair of one of the university's research committees. Most importantly, I have to disclose that he is, amongst others, a keen cricketer, cricket enthusiast, and supporter of Arsenal in England. He assures me that this is not a case of picking winners. Professor Fourie's story reminds me of a saying attributed to the well-known 19th century British economist John Stuart Mill, who remarked, "A person is unlikely to be an economist if he is nothing else." Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the pleasure to invite Professor Fourie to deliver his inaugural address as the 19th Professor of Economics at Stellenbosch University.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Estienne. Stan, COO, the Dean, Head of the Department, Ada Janssen, members of the faculty, colleagues, students, friends, and family. What a privilege it is to be here tonight amongst so many of you who have guided my own long walk in this department and to this moment. I want to begin by extending my gratitude to those who made tonight possible, Jonathan Dale, Amira, and their team. This lecture was also edited by my longtime collaborator, Di Kilbert. Behind every author, there is a patient editor who turns their ideas into coherent ones, and I thank Di for that. I want to thank Professors Estienne Karlitz, Professor Stan du Plessis, Professor Ada Janssen, Ingrid Woolard, for their contributions to tonight's festivities, and together with many other colleagues and mentors for the role they played in supporting my career along the way. Allow me 3 special thank yous. First, to someone who's not here, Ina Creer, who has been the administrative pillar of what I've been doing in the department and certainly at LEAP over the last decade and certainly over the last couple of years. I've kept her very busy. Second, Dr. Anton Ehlers, who I've seen here tonight, the former HOD of History, was instrumental in landing the Biography of an Uncharted People project that's funded by the Mellon Foundation 5 years ago. And thank you, Anton. I'm not sure where you are at the moment. There we go, there at the back. For underwriting that venture into the field of quantitative history. A lot of what I'll share tonight is the consequence of the work on that project. And a third special thank you go to Professor Andries Schoomby, my boss for 15 years, and for firstly appointing me in 2006, and then for his continued belief and encouragement in my work ever since. I want to thank my friends, many of whom are here tonight, and some of whom are joining online as well from various places, Pretoria, Germany, elsewhere in the world. My best friend is also in the room. Ilanya has been part of the ups and downs of an academic life over the last almost 2 decades. Thank you for helping me live life with passion. Finally, let me thank my parents, Wynand and Anine Fourie. I don't think they've ever imagined that this skinny kid from Bosch Street would grow up to be a professor in economics, but I must say, come to think of it, what else could the son of a history teacher and a librarian really become? So my options were very limited. Maar baie dankie vir alles wat julle vir my gedoen het. Dawid Fourie arrived on 24 November 2021, the firstborn son to Ilanya and Johan Fourie. It was an inauspicious start. On that day, South African scientists reported a new variant of the COVID-19 virus, Omicron. The backlash was immediate. The world locked South Africa out, cancelling flights and bookings on the eve of what we hoped would be a busy tourist summer. On top of this, the country was still reeling from the impact of violent protests in KwaZulu-Natal only a few months earlier. Hope of a quick recovery had faded. The minus 7% growth in 2020 was South Africa's worst in a century. There were much to be pessimistic about. And yet Dawid was born at a time which is, despite all the bad news, the best in history. Let us take just one measure of a good life, life expectancy. The average South African boy born in 2019 could expect to live to 62 years, or 66 years if fortunate enough to be born in the Western Cape. A girl could expect to live about 6 years longer. This is much longer than our ancestors lived only a few generations ago, when life expectancy ranged between 30 and 40 years. Averages, of course, mask large differences between South Africans, but the point remains for all subdivisions across race, class, gender, and geography, South Africans are living longer than at any time in the country's history. Economic history gives us the benefit of the long-run view. It helps us ask the right questions. Instead of, why are we poor? We ask the more historically accurate question, why are we so remarkably rich? Or in my example, why do we live so much longer than our ancestors? Asking these questions does not mean that we have solved the dual economic problems of production and distribution, and that we can now rest on our laurels. We have much still to do. Life expectancy in South Africa is at the low end of the global distribution. While women's average life expectancy in South Africa is 68 years, according to the World Bank, it is 78 in Morocco, 80 in Argentina, and 84 in Portugal. Clearly, we can still do better. I will argue tonight that South Africa's long walk to economic freedom have, despite many wrong turns, undeniably moved forward. This progress is the consequence of two beliefs: that we should use our knowledge of nature, or what we might call science and technology, to make us more productive, and so raise our standards of living. The second belief is that the benefits of this rising productivity should not be limited to an elite, but shared by ordinary men and women. We can see the results of this first belief throughout South African history. From learning to work iron, to adopting maize as a crop, to introducing new forms of money, all of which happened before the arrival of Europeans. New technologies were also adopted in the 18th century, when Europeans settled the southern tip of the continent, creating a level of prosperity that was amongst the highest in the world at the time. And innovation continued during the 19th and 20th centuries, accelerating South Africa's long walk towards economic freedom. But our progress has been hampered by one major failing. The sad truth is that the second belief, that increasing productivity should benefit all, has only very recently been embraced. Put differently, until 1994, the majority of South Africans were at best observers of South Africa's long walk. The good news is that many have now joined in. The bad news is that for a variety of reasons, many are still only limping along. To tell the story of South Africa's long walk to economic freedom, I have chosen to use the family history of the Fouries, of whom Dawid represents the 11th generation. It will indeed be a very personal journey. I will draw on chapters from my book, Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom, which spells out many of the lessons economic historians have learned in studying the progress of humankind over the millennia. And I will use the methods that my colleagues, my students, and I use at the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past, LEAP, the research unit I coordinate in the economics department. The economist and the quantitative social science historian have the means to open up histories from below. We want to answer the question, what gives ordinary people agency to build better lives? And what denies them the freedom to do so? But our ambition goes beyond simply answering the question. We want not only to describe the long walk to economic freedom, but ultimately to advance it. I was born in November 1982, another inauspicious year in this country's history. South Africa had a negative economic growth rate in both 1982 and 1983. Inflation was at 14%. Political tensions were on the rise. You can just visit the 1982 in South Africa Wikipedia page and count the references to bombs, for example. We moved to Paarl when I was a month old, which is where I spent the next 18 years. My father, Wynand, was a teacher first and then worked as a sales consultant for Cliff Granite. My mother, Anine, was a librarian at the Huguenot College in Wellington. My mum and dad met when they were studying at Stellenbosch. Of the 125,000 students who completed their undergraduate degrees before 2010, they were among the almost 1,000 Fouries, around 0.7% of the total. My mother enrolled in 1975 and my father in 1976, the first year that the undergraduate class at Stellenbosch had more than 2,000 students. They both graduated in 1978. During the 1970s, student numbers were increasing rapidly at Stellenbosch and at various other universities in South Africa. The reasons for this were, amongst others, economic, political, and social. Firstly, the South African economy was shifting from agriculture, mining, and manufacturing towards services. The GDP graph shows the sectoral shift over the past century, based on work that I did with colleague Wimpie Boshoff. The decline in agriculture from above 20% at the start of the century to below 5% at the end is quite striking. So that's a top bar. Secondly, to appease white voters in its project of racial segregation, the National Party made universities relatively affordable for white South Africans. In a 2016 paper, Estienne Collins and I showed that tuition fees at Stellenbosch University as a percentage of average income per person fell from 67% in 1911 to 26% in 1977, the year that both my parents were studying. By 2015, it had increased to 44%, so from 67% in 1911 to 26% and then up again to 44%. Today, the cost of higher education is on the increase in South Africa and globally. One consequence is that fewer from the bottom of the income distribution will have the opportunity for this upward mobility, as my parents did. We need to work harder at making university education more affordable. Thirdly, by the 1970s, white women were joining the labor market in large numbers. This echoed a global shift in the West during the 20th century. PhD student Amy Rommelsbacher has documented the rise of women doing clerical work in Cape Town from the 1930s onwards, and notably after 1950. This increasing involvement of women is visible in the enrollment figures at this university, which is shown on the graph. Largely because of white women obtaining the franchise in 1930 and aided by opportunities for women during the Second World War, female undergraduate enrollment was relatively high, above 40% for most of the century. The female share accelerated after 1994, as can be seen in the gender composition graph. the increase has been even greater for colored and black women after 1994. Both my parents came from a household where their mothers did not have formal labor market employment. My father grew up on an ostrich farm in Oudtshoorn called the Eiland. His father, my grandfather Johannes Jacobus Fourie, or Johan Fourie, was born in 1929 and died at the age of 80 in 2009. His wife, my grandmother, Katerina Fourie, or as I called her, Oma Kate, was mainly occupied with raising 7 children. Oma Kate died last year at the age of 90, 5 days after her great-grandson Dawid was born. Opa Johan and Oma Kate are both listed in the 1972 voters roll. Opa as a boer or a farmer, and Oma as a huisvrou, housewife. This voters roll recorded about 2.1 million white South Africans. I count about 15,500 Fouries, making them about 0.75% of the white population. Voters rolls, I predict, will become one of the most important resources for future generations of South African economic and quantitative historians. Individual level census records are increasingly used by economic historians worldwide to construct multi-generational longitudinal panels. Sadly, most of South Africa's early individual level census records have been lost or destroyed. But our voters' rolls offer an alternative, providing the names, ages, addresses, and occupations of all registered voters. While LEAP is currently supporting the transcription of the 1972 voters' roll, the 1984 voters' roll is already complete. There I count about 21,500 Fouries, an increase of 38% in just 12 years. Having reached voting age, my mum and dad are also included, listed as a teacher and a librarian. They must have been very busy though, because they failed to update the address. It is listed as Beacon Bay, East London, where I was born 2 years earlier, although we were living in Paarl at the time. Such errors should caution an overconfident interpretation of the results. Big data in history can come with big problems. My mother grew up in Paarl, the daughter of Simon Poerstamper, a fitter and turner, and Elsa Carstens, a homemaker. I never met my grandfather. He died in 1981, a year before I was born. He had a limp from polio as a child, a disease that has almost entirely been eradicated thanks to the invention of the polio vaccine in the 1950s, as the graph from Our World in Data shows. The graph shows, unfortunately, only data for South Africa from 1980, but the figures for the rest of the century comes from the US, and it basically, I think, reflects South Africa's figures as well. Despite the limp, my grandfather was apparently a great dancer, a passion I share with him. He was also a great fitter and turner, as I was told by our former Dean Johan de Villiers, who, fresh out of university, worked as his junior at Bakker in Paarl. Sadly, that gene was not handed down to me. Paarl is a town divided by the Berg River. On the western side is the predominantly white part of town, and the colored and increasingly black residents live on the eastern side. This was not always the case. During the 1950s and 1960s, thousands of colored residents were forcibly removed from their homes and transferred to other neighborhoods, often far from their jobs. The segregation introduced by the Groups Areas Act undeniably hurt their economic prospects. My mother's family had to move too, ironically. They were living in the part of the town that became classified as colored. From what I understand, my grandfather drove to Pretoria to complain about the regulations, but alas, without effect. That colored Paarl residents used to live on the western side of the river is evident from new data we are transcribing. For the past 5 years, a team of retired librarians and historians, including my mother, have been diligently transcribing the Paarl death notices. They reveal a town very different from the one I grew up in during the 1980s and 1990s. During my childhood, there were no colored residents in Bosch Street, in northern Paarl, where we lived. But when we analyze the death notices, we find that of the 227 deaths in Bosch Street between 1900 and 1930, 221, or 97%, were colored residents. What happened in Paarl, of course, was not unique. Forced segregation happened across South Africa, from small villages to big cities. The repercussions of apartheid spatial planning are still very apparent today. We began transcribing the death notices in 2018 to investigate the effects of the Spanish flu 100 years earlier. I could not have imagined that only 2 years later, the world would experience another pandemic. Our research on the 1918 flu was suddenly in demand. We submitted a report to the presidency in April 2020, and with Jonathan Jays, then a master's student, I published 2 papers showing the flu exacerbated existing inequalities in the healthcare system. a finding that has certainly relevance for today. The graph of mortality rates of Paarl residents by race shows clearly that the flu disproportionately affected colored residents. So I think there are two things to get from this graph. The first is that there are already quite big differences pre-pandemic between colored and white residents, but clearly during the pandemic, the right-hand column, you can clearly see the increase in mortality rates for colored residents relative to whites. That is not to say that death was not prevalent in all groups. As the graph for Oudtshoorn, where my great-grandfather lived, shows, many Fouries were also among the dead. Dawid Hermanus, a distant relative, died at the age of 93, a few weeks before the Spanish flu arrived. Andries Jonathan Fourie, by contrast, would not live to a ripe old age. He died 1 month later on the 15th of October at the age of 56. His cause of death is registered as pneumonia. The flu had arrived in Oudtshoorn. My great-grandfather, Wynand Breitenbach Fourie, born in 1897, was fortunate to survive the Spanish flu at 21, an age when many of a similar age perished. Perhaps it helped that Oudtshoorn was a rather prosperous place at the time of his birth, the result of the global demand for ostrich feathers. It all started, as many things do, with the French Revolution and Marie Antoinette's trend-setting ostrich feathered hats. A century later, in the 1880s, these were all the rage. By the turn of the century, women of all classes were wearing hats adorned with the hugely popular and now affordable ostrich plumes. Oudtshoorn did well out of the surge in demand. Between 1870 and 1900, the wealth of the district increased 3 times faster than that of the colony as a whole. But Cape wealth was increasing not only as a result of ostrich feathers. Together with Edward Kirby, Anton Ehlers, and Lloyd Maposa, a former PhD student, I analyzed the limited liability company records of the colony at the turn of the 20th century. Limited liability was introduced to make it easier to invest in private ventures. Rapid growth of private capital ensued, and Oudtshoorn was no exception. The photo shows a list of shareholders of the Oudtshoorn Recreation Ground Company, registered in 1883. The property was ultimately sold to the town council in 1899 and wound up in 1900. Although most of the surnames suggest English and Jewish investors, one Fourie, Andries Jonathan, appears in the list. He owned 10 shares. I suspect that this is the same Andries Jonathan who died during the Spanish flu. Oudtshoorn's boom came to an abrupt end in 1914. The war in Europe was not the only threat to the ostrich trade. The Model T Ford was gaining popularity. And who can keep a huge feathered hat on her head in an open motor car? The ostrich feather industry collapsed, and with it, Oudtshoorn's prospects. The lesson: technology disrupts, and almost always in unexpected ways. My great-grandfather was 17 when war broke out. As far as I know, he did not enlist to fight in the Great War, but many other South Africans did. When soldiers enlisted, they completed an attestation form, which recorded all kinds of biographical information, including the recruit's height. Economic historians have found creative ways to measure the living standards of past generations. We do not always have access to incomes or wealth, which are standardly used today to measure the well-being of society, so we have to find alternatives. Height has been found to be a reliable proxy. A person's height is 80% determined by their genes, but 20% by their environment. The better they are fed as infants, for example, the taller they are likely to grow. If we find that the average height of a society increased over time, we can attribute the increase to its children being better fed. In other words, society has become more prosperous. This is exactly what I and several co-authors have been doing over the past few years in a project with Bukang Mpeta, a former student and colleague, and Chris Inwood, a Canadian colleague. We analyzed the heights of white and black recruits in attestation forms from the South African War and First and Second World Wars, as well as several other data sets. This graph of heights of white and black South Africans show that the difference was large at the start of the 20th century and widened over the course of the century. It is especially the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the period of land expropriation and other discriminatory policies, that explains the divergence. Martine Mariotti, Chris Inwood, and I recently investigated the heights of white South Africans from 1865 to 1920. We found that before the country became widely industrialized, white South African males were some of the tallest in the world. a consequence of the high protein diet of the largely rural population. My great-grandfather was apparently one of them, being 6'7", or about 2 meters tall. My father's recollection of him was that he wore a size 15 shoe. My great-grandfather's father did not fight in the South African War of 1899 to 1902, a war between the British Cape Colony and Natal on the one side and the Transvaal and Orange Free State Boer republics on the other. But many other Fouries did. When the Boer As former PhD student Abel Gwaindepi has shown, there was another reason for the poor bargaining position of the liberal-minded Cape politicians after the war. The colony had extremely high debt, a consequence of the large debt-funded investments in railways. The driving force behind the expansion of the railways was Cecil John Rhodes. His company, De Beers, benefited from this because it lowered transport costs to the Kimberley mines, allowing mine owners to pay less for inputs and wages. But the mining companies paid little taxes, which could have helped fund the railway expansion. There is no doubt, though, that the railways, as elsewhere in the world, boosted the economic transformation of the South African interior. Alfonso Ranz-Loncan and I calculate that a quarter of GDP growth between 1860 and 1909 could be explained by the arrival of the railways. But money had to be found to pay for this rapid expansion of infrastructure, and it was ultimately the Transvaal gold mines after unification that enabled the Cape to settle its debt. The cost was the loss of the black franchise. The railways are an example of how a new technology can create economic prosperity. But it's also an example of how a political system that only serves a small part of the population can allow a political elite to capture the rents of this new technology to the detriment of many and widen inequality. It is clear that political and economic freedoms go hand in hand. My great-great-grandfather, Dawid Hermanus Petrus Fourie, was born in 1870 at the start of South Africa's mineral revolution. Diamonds had just been discovered and all sorts of people were flocking to Kimberley in search of riches. Kara Dimitrik, a former LEAP postdoc student, has shown that this sudden demand for labor on the mines had a surprising impact on the Cape Colony. Farmers suddenly had to find a way to keep their laborers on the farms. Farm owners had two options. They could use the carrot or the stick. The carrot approach would mean that they should pay higher wages. This is what one would expect in a competitive economy and in a democratic society. But the Cape farmers had political power, and they used it to push for more severe coercive legislation, with harsher punishments for those laborers who absconded. Labor coercion had a long history at the Cape. Dawid Hermanus Petrus' father, Dawid Hermanus Fourie, was born in 1822, when the Cape was still a slave economy. Slavery was abolished when he was 12 years old, although the former slaves still had to work for another 4 years as apprentices. On 1 December 1838, the almost 40,000 people who had been enslaved at the Cape could finally take their first step towards economic freedom. Dawid Hermanus was too young to have been an independent farmer at the time of emancipation, but his father, Stephanus Johannes Fourie, born in 1798, was 40 when slavery was abolished. It seems very likely that he had slaves working on his farm. So how would we find this out? In 2010, the historian Hans Jesse began to build a database of all the slaves recorded in the slave valuation rolls for the Cape Colony. These rolls were compiled after the Slavery Abolition Act was passed in 1833 by the British government, declaring that slaves in the British Empire had to be freed. There was an important condition, however. All slave owners had to be compensated for the loss of what was then considered their property. Lists of all the slaves were drawn up, together with their occupation, origin, age, gender, and value, as well as details of their owners. The total value of the slaves in the colony amounted to more than £3 million. But after compensation had been allocated, the Cape received only £1.2 million. Many slave owners, therefore, received far less than what they expected. Combining the slave valuation rolls with the compensation payments enabled Kate Hekema, Lisa Martin, Hans Jesse, and me to build the slave emancipation dataset. This dataset will make it possible for us to study the financial underpinnings of slavery in the colony. We have already found, for example, that the emancipation shifted economic power from the countryside to the city. In Cape Town, many of the merchants who acted as intermediaries between London and the Cape to enable the former owners to get their compensation money, established thriving banks and insurance companies. Others invested in housing, as Kate Ekema and Robert Ross have shown in new work, becoming landlords to those who were formerly enslaved. Surprisingly, I could not find Stephanus Johannes Fourie in our slave emancipation dataset, but I suspect that was because he was not a very successful farmer. He farmed just outside Oudtshoorn in the district called Volmoed, meaning hopeful. His farm, shown on the map of 5,500 farms at the Cape Colony in 1850. The black dots are Fourie-owned farms, and there were 37 of them, or about 0.7% of the total. I did, however, find Stephanus Johannes' father, another Dawid Hermanus Fourie, who owned 7 slaves. They were May, Frans, Albertus, Mavira, Adam, Damon, and Regina, 6 men and 1 woman. The oldest was 33, the youngest 13. The violin plot shows the distribution of ages of all slaves in the George district. The large number of men above 30 reflects the higher demand for men in the slave trade, a trade that was outlawed by the Slave Trade Act of 1807, almost 30 years earlier. It is unclear what happened to Dawid Hermanus' 7 slaves after emancipation. PhD student Lisa Martin is currently investigating the factors that would have motivated a former slave to move to Cape Town or to one of the many mission stations that had begun to dot the landscape. It is, however, very likely that after gaining their freedom, they remained on the farm as laborers, as many did. Although they were valued at a total of £907, the Dawid Hermanus received only £260, or 43% of the total value. It is perhaps no surprise that his son, though living in the hopeful district of Volmoed, called his farm Armoed, meaning poverty. Dawid Hermanus Fourie, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, was the fifth son of Stephanus Fourie. Stephanus was born in 1734, married Helena Lategan at the age of 21, and died at the age of 90 in 1825, having lived long enough to see the birth of his great-grandchild in 1822. During his lifetime, he saw many great changes. The Cape Colony grew from a fledgling settlement around Cape Town to a vast territory reaching the Gariep River in the north and the Fish River in the east. Stephanus was the 20th child of Louis Fourie, the first Fourie to arrive in South Africa. Louis settled on the farm the Slangenrivier in 1699, close to today's Wellington. Linton Park Wines, the new name of the farm, still makes a Louis Fourie reserve range. Surprisingly, none of the Louis Fourie's 9 surviving sons wanted to inherit the farm at his death in 1750. All had moved into the interior beyond the first mountain ranges that separate the Cape Peninsula from the drier interior. Stephanus probably moved to the Klein Karoo at the age of 16. Soon after the death of his father, he settled in the Gamka district where his ancestors are still farming more than 10 generations later. Louis Fourie and the other Europeans who arrived in Table Bay did not find the Cape an empty land. The winter rainfall area of the Western and Southern Cape was inhabited by the indigenous Khoisan. One of their clans, the Goronaikona, lived in the shadow of Table Mountain. Its leader, Achumau, was soon appointed by the Dutch East India Company as translator. He sent his 12-year-old niece, Kretua, to work in the household of Jan van Riebeeck, the first commander of the Cape Station under company rule. In 1664, Kretua married Pieter van Meerhof, a Dutch surgeon, becoming the first Khoisan to marry according to Christian custom. They had 3 children, and after her husband's death, sadly, she suffered a personal decline and was ultimately banished to Robben Island, where she died in 1673. But this was not the end of her legacy. Pieter Nella, one of her daughter, married Daniel Simon, the company gardener. And today, all South Africans with the surname Simon, or Zaiman, can trace their ancestry to Kretua. And because my great-grandfather married a Zaiman, I too am a descendant. The story of why Europeans decided to settle the Cape is familiar to most of us. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602 to exploit the lucrative trade in spices between the East Indies and Europe, needed a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope to supply passing ships with fresh water, wood, and meat, and the vegetables that were vital to ward off scurvy. The first company officials arrived in 1652 to establish the fort, and they soon ran out of supplies, and within 5 years had released 9 company servants to become vrije burgers, or free settlers. But despite the word free, there was little economic freedom. The settlers were forced to sell all their produce to the company stores in Cape Town and banned from engaging in manufacturing or trading with the passing ships. They were also banned from trading with the Khoisan, despite the eagerness on both sides to do so. Because of these restrictions, the Cape was generally seen as an economic backwater, a place of slow growth and subsistence living. In fact, the latest Oxford Handbook of the South African Economy, published only last year, subscribes to the view that wealthy farmers and merchants only emerged after Dutch rule ended in 1795. Historians, whether Afrikaner nationalists or English liberals, have had their own reasons for wanting to believe in an origin story of Afrikaner poverty. But were those settler farmers like Stephanus and his 8 brothers really so desperately poor? This is the question that attracted me to economic history. When in 2007, Wimpy Boshoff and I found a data set of ships that arrived in Table Bay, we decided to see how this traffic affected the annual output of wheat, wine, and meat on Cape farms. We submitted our paper to a conference in Portugal, and in our conference slot, only 4 people showed up, the 4 presenters. It was awkward, and at a meeting for economists afterwards, I raised the point that in my future it might be better if papers were grouped according to their method rather than the geographical location of their topic. A Dutch scholar, Jan Leighton van Zanden, came up to me afterwards and asked me to send him the paper. A few months later, he invited me to Utrecht for a visit, and there he asked me whether I considered doing a PhD in economic history. Of course, I knew very little about the field, so I said yes. In academia, as in life, serendipity plays a large role. My advice is to take as much advantage of it as possible. Under Jan Leighton's guidance and that of Professor Stan du Plessis, I delved into the probate inventories of settler farmers in the Dutch Cape Colony, stored in the Cape Archives. To my surprise, in comparison with other settler societies, and even in comparison with some of the richest countries in the 18th century, like England and Holland, Cape farmers were remarkably rich. I confirmed this when I compared my findings with the tax censuses collected by the Dutch East India Company. Cape settlers owned, on average, 55 head of cattle and about 350 sheep. They also owned 10 chairs, 4 books, and 5 paintings. By way of comparison, Ilanya and I certainly did not own 10 chairs and 5 paintings in our apartment at the time, and those were just averages. These were clearly not subsistence farmers. Yet we should also not equate their better than expected living standards to the fortunate lives we live today. There are many reasons why we live far more comfortable lives than our ancestors. I mentioned at the start that life expectancy today for men born in the Western Cape is about 65 years. Jean Cellier and I calculated that the median lifespan of settler men at the Cape during the 18th century was 40 years. This was similar to the lifespan of men in almost all other societies before the late 19th century advances in medical science, nutrition, and sanitation. I wanted to know not only how affluent these settlers were, but why. What made some excel and others fall behind? This is the fundamental question of economic history. Why is it that some are rich and others not, or not yet? The tax censuses seem to me to have the most potential to answer this question. But they were huge, and there were hundreds of them. Surely this data could be put to some use if only I could find a partner with deep pockets. Fortunately, in the early 2010s, I received an email from a guitar-playing Swedish economic historian. I should add that he's also a Marxist and a socialist, and he's also in the room tonight. He told me he wanted to work on the archival records of Transvaal farms, but I soon convinced him that the Cape farms were a better bet. The Transvaal records are scanty, as Kera Dimitrik, Sophia du Plessis, and Stan du Plessis have shown. By contrast, the Cape tax censuses, or opgaafrolle, offered immense possibilities. So we began a collaboration that has flourished. In September 2020, we received the extraordinary news that our Cape of Good Hope panel project would be funded by the Swedish Riksbanken, becoming the biggest humanities and social science project in Swedish history. We are now well on our way to transcribing all the Cape tax censuses, which will, we hope, be the world's largest intragenerational and multi-generational panel dataset. On one of our earlier projects, colleague Dieter van Vintel and I found that one subgroup of Cape farmers were particularly productive. The Huguenots who had fled France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Most of them crossed the border to German territories or went to Holland, England, or the Americas. But about 150 found their way to the southern tip of Africa. We found that the refugees were good at making one thing that is still the cornerstone of the Stellenbosch economy, wine. In recent work, master student Tiaan de Swart has replicated our study, now based on the expanded Cape of Good Hope panel. He found that the Huguenot advantage persisted for 2 to 3 to even 4 generations after their arrival, meaning that they kept their winemaking skills well within the family. Louis, the first Fourie in South Africa, does not appear to have been as successful in this endeavor as his Huguenot compatriots, judging by his farm output. I asked Tiaan to compare the Fourie farmers with the other Huguenots, and they seem to be far less productive. In future, the transcribed tax censuses will allow us to map the individual life course of each of the thousands of Cape settlers, just as I have done for the first 18 years that Louis Fourie appears in the records. The technical difficulties of matching these individuals across time will be severe. The graph of Louis Fourie's children, slaves, and agricultural assets for those 18 years shows that his name was spelled differently in each of the first 13 tax censuses he appeared in. And you can see the different spellings on the graph. But if we can rise to the challenge, the opportunities are immense. Here we observe Louis increasing the size of his household over time, despite the deaths of several of his children and his first wife, Suzanne Cordier, in 1713. By 1718, he had remarried, this time to Anne Jourdan, with whom he went on to have another 12 children. Although Louis is recorded in the census for the first time only in 1700, he had arrived 12 years earlier, on 12 May 1688, aboard the Borsenburg. With him were his friend Pierre Lombard and Pierre's wife, Marie Couture. The three of them were part of a small group of Huguenot refugees who had escaped from Livron, a town on the southern French province of Dauphine, hiking more than 1,400 kilometers to find refuge in the Walloon Church of Amsterdam. Louis was around 18 years old. He was illiterate and a farm laborer, escaping the Catholic dragoons who were persecuting the Protestant Huguenots. Louis met Pierre and Marie on the way to Amsterdam. We know this from the records that survive of their receiving assistance along the way. Because Louis was illiterate, his name was recorded by others in a variety of ways. The photo shows the entry of the Walloon Church records for 21 December 1687. Just below the entry of Pierre Lombard and his wife, it says, Louis Fourie pour le Cap. Louis Fourie on his way to the Cape. At the Cape, after repeated misspellings, Fourie, as it was spelled there, became simply Fourie. Louis Fourie's long walk to economic freedom, from farm laborer persecuted for his religion to Cape farmer with 99 grandchildren, is testament to his ingenuity and spirit. But it is also testament to the support he received from the society he had entered as a migrant. Louis probably first found a job as a farmhand. Then in 1699 he had the opportunity to acquire a freehold farm with secure property rights. The company offered loans to newly arrived settlers, and I find in a new project where we are transcribing the cash books of the Dutch Reformed Church that the church also gave sizable loans, and this is an example of that. Several Huguenots received a loan, and although I have not yet found any evidence for it, it is very likely that Louis Fourie did too. In conclusion, the things that make people more productive are scientific and technological innovation, an entrepreneurial spirit, and the cultural norms and values and institutions that foster those. The way we spread the returns is by making education available to all, ensuring that women can participate on an equal footing, opening access to credit and financial markets, protecting democracy and the rule of law, curbing legislation and regulations that inhibit free choice, including the free movement of people, and giving ordinary people a social safety net so they will be empowered to take risks. But the first step in our long walk to economic freedom is to know that despite the hardships we face every day and our concerns about the future of our region, of our country, of our continent, and of our planet, we live much better lives than our ancestors. Economic historians help us learn from the past so we can build an even more prosperous future for Dawid Fourie and the generations to come. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's within a few months of 30 years since I arrived in my residence room to tell my actuarial science roommate that after the lecture I had just attended, I'm afraid my actuarial science career is ruined. The lecture was on St. Augustine, and it was a lecture by the economic historian, Professor Sampi, of whom we heard earlier today. And Johan's outstanding lecture this evening reminded me of why I told my roommate that my actuarial science career is ruined. What a wonderful subject presented to us by a real master of the subject. Now, I'm reminded of the inaugural lecture of Lord Acton, not an economic historian, sadly, but at least a historian, when at the University of Cambridge he ended his lecture with a salutation about the role of inaugural lectures and what we learn from scholars when we listen to their inaugural lectures. And he said, whatever a person's notions of these last centuries are, such in the main the person, him or herself, will be. Under the name of history, they cover the articles of his philosophic, his religious, and his political creed. They give his measure. They denote his character. As a student and a colleague and a friend, it has been an outstanding pleasure to see Johan's developing thought as an economic historian. His inspirational academic leadership as he brought a whole group of scholars, young and experienced, along. As the founder of the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past. As a renowned author, both for an academic audience and for the general public. And as an academic citizen who served his university very ably on the University Council. This evening we heard him tell a story about our society and about economics more generally against the backdrop of Dawid Johannes, Johan, Wynand, Johannes Jacobus, Wynand Breitenbach, Dawid Hermanus Petrus, Dawid Hermanus, Stephanus Johannes, Dawid Hermanus, Stephanus, and Louis. I observed, by the way, that Stephanus married my wife in 1735. So that, if nothing else, Johan, we are distant cousins. You use this history to point to the major forces that have made us so astonishingly prosperous. Powerful technology. And you didn't omit the fact that this powerful technology is often disruptive, and disruptive in unpredictable ways. I was struck by the way you tied together the story of technology in South Africa also with the story of fiscal mismanagement. You spoke about the role of universities, especially at the lower income levels, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the most powerful things that we do. You spoke about women's entrance into the labor market. You cautioned us that big data can come with big problems in economics, as indeed elsewhere. You showed us the power of inspirational institutional developments, such as the emergence of limited liability companies, which Martin Wolf called the greatest single development in economics. And you didn't shy away from reprehensible economic institutions, such as slavery. And I want to thank you for naming the slaves of Dawid Hermanus, because so often when we do scholarly work on slavery, we fail to humanize the work, and you have been eminently an example to all of us for the humane character with which you have studied sometimes very difficult work. Johan, I want to thank you for this tour of your ancestors, of your research, and mostly of the passionate character with which you are a professor. Stellenbosch University, our entire community, could scarcely have had a better 19th professor of economics. Thank you for this lecture. Thank you for sharing it with us. Baie dankie, Johan, baie geluk.
Last part of the inaugural lecture. Thank you very much, Johan, for an inspiring speech, and also to Stan for the response. But I would like to start off to first congratulate Johan on this journey. It is really a milestone achievement. And formally and officially welcome the 19th full professor into the Department of Economics. It is indeed a privilege for the department to have colleagues of this stature. And I must say, Johan, I recall when I started at Stellenbosch University in 2004, Johan had just begun his postgraduate studies, starting with the honours program. And he was actually one of the first tutors I appointed when I started the tutorial program in 2005. So what an inspirational journey, and for me to witness this as well. And yes, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be no stopping Johan with all the successive and future achievements. So just a huge congratulations to Johan and his family. And on behalf of the department, I would like to thank Estienne, I would like to thank Ingrid and Stan for your presence and participation in the ceremony. I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful event. And then I would like to thank all the colleagues, friends, online, in the audience that have joined us for this wonderful evening. And yes, please join us afterwards for some refreshments and to still sort of end off this wonderful evening for Johan. So thank you very much for being here.